Hello everyone and welcome to Hidden Existence, the channel where, people can share their encounters and experiences in a safe environment, I'd like to think, and where we can learn and be enlightened to many strange things that are going out there in the world that we have no answers for, but many, many questions. I've got a great show tonight with a great guest, also a great co-host. Hello and welcome, Brent Thomas. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. How are you? How's everybody?
Thank you. That's my neighbour ringing me for some.
That's about perfect.
We've got a great guest tonight. My guest has been taking calls on UFO sightings and other strange reports from the public since 1969. So that's 50 years, 51 years, and continues to receive unusual reports on a regular basis. He's been seen on many, many channels: History, Discovery, Sci-Fi Channel, author, documentary producer, film producer, many, many other talents and things to my guest. Welcome, Stan Gordon.
Hello, and thank you for having me on your program.
You're welcome. I'm so pleased that you've come on tonight. Really honoured that you've come on to share your many, many reports and insights into what's going on with the UFO and Bigfoot.
Yes, I'm here in Pennsylvania. I'm about 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And actually, I started my research in 1959 when I was 10 years old.
Wow.
And I've been out in the field since 1965 after the Kecksburg UFO incident doing firsthand investigation. So this year marks 61 years of research for me. And I'm sure it'll be of interest to most of your listeners that I've never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot myself. I've interviewed thousands of witnesses. I've seen a lot of evidence, but I've never had my own personal encounter.
That's incredible. How did it start then? What was the fascination?
Well, I was a curious youngster interested in science, and my birthday happened to be, around the Halloween season. And my parents happened to give me a radio, an AM radio, as a birthday gift. And I was tuning around the radio dial, the AM radio dial back in those days, and there were some radio shows talking about strange events, haunted houses, flying saucers, strange creatures, and I was curious. I began to go to the local library and began to read all the books they had on the subject. And that's how it started for me. And I was 16 years old when the incident near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania occurred. And I started documenting that information. I was breaking on the news that evening, and I've been out in the field ever since.
If you can break down for those that don't know, what happened at Kecksburg? What was the incident?
Well, it's a long story. We could spend hours just talking about Kecksburg. The event was on December 9th, 1965. And how I happened to first learn about it, I was tuned into one of the big Pittsburgh radio stations that night. They had a talk radio show, and they had a special guest on. You might recognize the name. It was Frank Edwards, who back in those days was a very well-known journalist who had written some books on strange happenings. And I wanted to tune in to listen to see what Frank Edwards had to say. And curiously and interestingly, almost the entire radio show is focusing on this breaking news story that multiple witnesses from Ontario, Canada, and over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania see this brilliant fiery object moving across the sky. Okay. And as the evening continued on, many people were calling in, describing what they saw. The radio station, the news is talking about people, what they saw, what took place. And then reports came in that whatever the object was, it apparently fell to a wooded ravine in the little village of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, in Westmoreland County, for around 40-some miles outside of Pittsburgh. And that evening, as more radio and TV is being broadcast, apparently hundreds of people descend on that small farming community to try to get a look at what the object was that fell down into the woods. But there's a lot we didn't know that day as it's breaking on the news. And most interesting that evening were the reports that the military was now arriving in the Kecksburg area to search for an unidentified flying object. So this became a major news story. It was covered locally, nationally, and even internationally. And the next day, the official explanation was that it was just a bright meteor in the sky, that people had been mistaken, nothing had fallen to the ground, and officially, that was the end of the story. But I began to try to follow up on it the next day. It was very little information, but over a period of many weeks and months and years, I tracked down hundreds of people who were involved in the incident. And I learned considerably more than anybody knew at the time. And it's a very, very long, fascinating story. But one of the things that I found out over many, many years, tracking down leads, getting details from different people, getting anonymous tips, what I found out was that soon after the object fell, some of the local residents hurried down into the woods and came across a large metallic, kind of an off-gold, bronze-colored, acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. So this was a large metallic object that was seamless. It had no weld marks, no seams, no rivet marks on it. It was one solid piece of metal, big enough for a man to stand up inside of. But at the back part, the raised up section, like you would have on an acorn, people who were standing very close to it said there were markings, something more like symbols, raised up off the surface. And luckily, one of the witnesses who was there, because of his background, he was familiar with Russian, Cyrillic, and he said that definitely was not what it was. It looked more like some type of hieroglyphic, some type of ancient writing. And that fellow, over the years, went to libraries from his memory, trying to remember what some of these symbols look like. And he said from his recall, the closest would have been like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And I later learned there were many, many witnesses that saw a large military flatbed tractor trailer go in empty and later come out of the area with a large object on it covered with a tarp. And I later had independent confirmation that that truck and the object left early the next morning, left that area, went to Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio, stayed there under very heavy security. They backed the truck and the object into a hangar. They set up a security team. I was told they were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody who approached that hangar without the proper clearance. It stayed at the base for a short time, then continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And later I was told exactly what building it was taken to. Where the object is today, we don't know. And there still is a lot of theories and ideas as to what that object was. Whatever it was moving relatively slowly. It may change in direction along its path, along its trajectory. And local witnesses who saw the thing come across the sky and go down said it did not go down at a high rate of speed. For example, if you saw a meteor coming down or re-entry of space debris would have come down at a high speed, this came down, they said, almost like it was controlled. And the people who saw the object on the ground said, other than knocking trees over and damaging trees, the object itself was basically intact, semi-buried on the ground. So it's a very fascinating story. There's a lot more to it. We could talk for days about it. But that was the case that really started me on my lifetime pursuit into investigating thousands of other cases.
Yeah, well, you've made a documentary called The Kecksburg, The Untold Story. Where can people find that if they want to?
It's still available on DVD. I believe they can order it. I think it's available on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. I think it's probably available on Amazon UK. But that's how they would have to try to obtain that or my books.
Okay, I'll find some links and I'll put them in descriptions for people for the end of the show. How did it start that people were contacting you for reports? How did you become the guy for that, the go-to?
How I started, there was a small group of research people in Pittsburgh. It was a small group called the UFO Research Institute. It was mainly some scientists and engineers from around the Pittsburgh area and some other professionals, and that is actually the group that Stanton Friedman started in. So I knew Stanton from the time that he began his field investigations. He was a little older than me, but I got to know him well. And I stayed with their group. And actually, because I had a lot of experience already interviewing people, I became a telephone sighting coordinator. So when they would get a report, I would get the initial report, do some of the initial interviews, and determine if the case warranted further investigation. And I stayed with them until they closed down their operation. And in 1969, I decided to set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings. So I began to make contact with the local police and the news media, told them what I was interested in doing. And you got to remember, that's a long time ago. There was a lot more ridicule of the subject back then, but I tried to handle it very seriously. And within weeks of people learning about my phone number, the telephone in my home was ringing day and night. And I was getting calls on everything unusual, not just UFOs, but alleged haunted houses, strange creatures, anything strange I was getting calls about. Well, it got to the point very quickly that I realized I was not able to handle all these calls and reports myself. So it became my focus to try to organize a volunteer group of research people to go out to investigate these type of reports. So in 1970, I founded the first of three groups. That was called the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group. I was even amazed who I got involved. And the high majority of the people who I got involved with did it anonymously because of their positions. So I had scientists and engineers and technicians and police officers and former military people, all kinds of specialists who were doing this. We did this around our full-time jobs, but I had it set up that we could respond to cases 24 hours a day. And by 1973, we had extended to cover the whole state of Pennsylvania. And we were just being inundated with reports all the time coming in. And of course, a lot of the cases we were able to explain. And my position has always been to be open-minded but skeptical, to look at the data and try to figure out what people were reporting. And yes, there were many misidentifications with UFOs, just as there is today. We're getting a lot of Starlink satellite reports and Venus reports and drones and many other things that people see and they look unusual, but they're explainable. But every year we get reports that you cannot easily dismiss. And I have hundreds and hundreds of cases I worked on, some which we can talk about that are just very, very detailed UFO cases. And also I've worked on hundreds of Bigfoot sightings and cryptid cases. And I've come to the conclusion that yes, while you can explain many of these reports, there are still quite a lot of cases reported by very credible people that you cannot easily dismiss. Something is going on out there, and the more I know about the phenomenon, the stranger that it is. I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, definitely. So what's the give me some examples of the unusual kind of reports that come in.
Well, again, a lot of UFO reports, even I can tell you over the years, there have been, again, multitudes of amazing UFO cases. And many of these are cases people are not even aware of. Now, more locally, people would know about in certain areas. And back 1973, we should probably go back a little bit in history. 1973, here in Pennsylvania, first we had the biggest UFO outbreak ever documented. Hundreds and hundreds of UFO reports all year long. And many of these were not high altitude. They were not just lights in the sky. These were large structured objects, quite often very close to the ground, a very low level, some cases very close to witnesses, hovering over vehicles, chasing cars, UFO landing reports. It was amazing. And very often my teams would be on the scene within minutes to hours after these incidents occurred. That's why we were able to document it so well. And back in those days, of course, you got to remember 1973, there's no internet, there's no cell phones. So a lot of the local news media and even some of the national media were picking up a lot of these stories. So there was many, many accounts of cases we worked on and even others in other areas where they were occurring that were making the news. So all of these UFO sightings in themselves were amazing. But then in the summer of 1973, we had the biggest outbreak of Bigfoot sightings documented. That went on for months and months, early into 1973. And many of those Bigfoot sightings were very close range. Sometimes there was more than one or two creatures together. So quite often there was physical evidence at the scene. It was amazing, just amazing what was going on with the details, the reports coming in. And then we began to notice some very And these were not things that we were looking for. These were the kind of reports coming in from the public or being called in to the police departments, and then they would be investigated. And some of these cases were just amazing, and some of these cases began to show patterns and began to indicate to us that we were dealing with a phenomenon that was much stranger than any of us had ever imagined. When I got involved in this, I was interested in Bigfoot and cryptids and whatever, again, many, many years ago. So I started investigating Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania back in the 1960s. And there had always been a lot of history of Bigfoot in Pennsylvania, going back to the Native Americans. There are many accounts in newspapers in the 1800s to talk about the wild man of the woods. They didn't call it Bigfoot back then, but describing something similar. And I started investigating reports again back in the 1960s in Pennsylvania. When I got involved, from what I knew about Bigfoot, I felt that these were likely some type of unknown primate, some type of unknown animal that science had never been able to confirm. But then all these reports are coming in, and we're beginning to realize there's some very strange aspects of the phenomena. And I'll be glad to tell you about some of the interesting cases that stand out, and they're very detailed accounts.
Yeah, I would appreciate that if you share them.
Well, there were numerous ones, and again, we could talk for days just about some of these cases. But anyhow, one of the ones that stands out in my mind was September 27, 73. This would have been north of Pittsburgh, up in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. There were two young women out in the country waiting for a friend to stop by to take them somewhere. And while they're standing there in the woods, they see this 7 to 8 foot tall, huge hair-covered creature with white hair. You don't hear about too many Bigfoot sightings with white hair, but we do have those kind of reports. And they see this thing running towards the wooded area. That in itself was unusual, but in one of its hands, it was carrying a glowing ball of light.
Wow.
And a short time later, an object came across the sky and projected a beam of light down into the woods where the creature ran into. So that caught our attention, among other reports. But it was an event that happened outside of the town of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, up in Fayette County. You'll hear me mention, I'm sure, Fayette County quite a bit. A lot of history, a lot of strange phenomena, and continues to be, even to this day, many reports in recent months up in that area, and there is every year, a phenomena. But the case that occurred that really stands out, and is probably the case of all cases I worked on, occurred October 25th, 1973. I'm going to give you the brief part of the story because we could go for hours just on this story alone. It's probably one of the strangest cases ever documented in the world. And it was very well documented because we were there within hours after it happened. And there were multiple reports for about a 24-hour period coming in on my hotline of UFO sightings in many parts of Pennsylvania that evening, that day. And I got a phone call from a state police officer, state trooper, from the Uniontown barracks up in Fayette County that evening around 10:30 p.m. He said he just came back from investigating this incident. He thought that there was a possibility that something was still up in the farmer's field. And he asked me if I could get a team together and get up there as soon as possible. Well, what I learned was that about 9 o'clock that evening, about 15 people in that farming community, that rural community, they observed this object. It's about as big as a barn. It's a big red sphere, about 100 feet off the ground, and slowly moving downward. And there's people standing outside in this area watching this thing in the sky coming down. And the farmer's son, it was on his dad's property. He was coming out to visit his family. And as he's riding down the road, he sees people standing outside in this thing in the sky. So he decides to go to a neighbor up on a hill so he can see it better. And when he gets up there, it looks like this big red ball is going to land in his dad's pasture. So there were 2 young boys in that house, and he and those 2 boys decide they want to go up and see what this thing is. So he stopped over at his dad's farm before they went up, and he grabs a handful of ammunition and a 30-06, which is a very high-powered weapon. He didn't realize at the time, but he had 2 tracer rounds in that ammunition. So anybody that hunts is aware that when you fire those trays, you get a luminous trail. So anyhow, as they're going down the farm lane towards that direction of the pasture, the dogs throughout the area are barking and going crazy. They're very upset. They hear this loud whining noise and hear these baby crying sounds. And as they're getting closer, the sounds get louder. They angle their vehicle, their truck, and they have their beams, the high beams, the headlights are on so they can see where they're going, but they're looking at it and realizes that it looks like something's draining the power from the headlights. They never saw that before, like it's losing power. Anyhow, they make their way up to the top of the hill to get to the pasture, and they're standing there looking across the field, and to their amazement, here's this huge object, maybe 100 feet or more in diameter, now on the ground or right above it. Mm-hmm. It's not now a complete sphere. It's like a half of sphere, like a big white dome that's illuminating the whole area and making this loud whining noise. They just can't believe what they're seeing. They're trying to figure it out. But in a few minutes, their attention is drawn about 75 feet away. There's a section of barbed wire fence. And along the barbed wire fence are these 2 tall, bipedal, upright, hair-covered creatures, one behind the other, stiffly walking in their direction. The one in front about 8 feet tall. The fence post was 6 foot. They were much taller than the fence post. The one in front about 8 feet tall. The one behind it's about 7 feet tall. The arms, they're covered with long, dark, matted hair. The arms are so long, they're hanging down almost to the ground.
Wow.
They have no neck. They have large, luminous, glowing green eyes, and they're making that baby crying, whining noise. Well, the one boy so frightened, he runs out of the field. The other boy starts yelling, "Shoot him, shoot him." So the older fellow had the rifle. He fires his first shot. The first shot is a tracer. He had that luminous trail. Wow. He fires the second shot, which is the other tracer, and something very fascinating occurs. When he fires that second tracer, the largest of the 2 creatures makes a loud whining crying sound, reaches out with his right hand towards the tracers that are trying to grab it. And the exact moment it does that, that huge object in the field suddenly vanishes and disappears. It doesn't take off, it's just gone. Most luminosity is gone, the sound stops, the creatures turn around, start walking back towards the woods along the fence line. At that point, the fellow is loading his gun, and he's fired live ammo into the creatures with his 30-06. And this guy had been hunting for years and years, and he said, "I know I hit them." He said, in particular, that large one. He said, "I was firing live ammo into it with my 30-06. And he said, it just kept staring at me with those glowing green eyes with no effect on them whatsoever." So they ran back to their truck. They went back to the farmhouse, told the family what happened. They took them to a neighbor's, and that's when they called the state police. And when the trooper arrived 45 minutes later, they went in the patrol car up to the area so the trooper could investigate to look for evidence. And the trooper told me, he said, the area where the object was on the ground, that whole area was self-luminescent and glowing, about 100 feet or more in diameter. He said the glow extended up off the ground. He said the farm animals wouldn't go anywhere near it. He said if he had a newspaper, he believed he could read the newspaper from the light coming off the glowing area.
Wow.
And again, this is the short part of the story. It got stranger and stranger through the night. What I was told was they left the scene. They went back to the state police barracks. Both the trooper and the witness were separately interviewed in 2 separate rooms. Then they called me to send my team up. And we got there early in the morning. It was a distance away. We had to pack our radiation equipment, our radios, all our gear, and we found our way up there. And it was it's probably one of the strangest cases ever documented. There's no doubt it happened whatsoever. The question is, what was it? And I don't think anybody knows for sure. And I am not suggesting that Bigfoot was a passenger in a spaceship from another planet, because we don't know for sure what we're dealing with the UFO phenomena. Yeah, I've been doing this for a long, long time. I've investigated thousands and thousands of UFO cases over the years. And I said many years ago, from the data that I've seen, we're dealing with more than one origin for the unknown category of UFOs. And of course, when I was growing up back in the day, everything's extraterrestrial. And I keep an open mind to all possibilities. But the more I know about the phenomena, that's one possibility that might explain maybe certain percentage of reports. But the more I look into the phenomena, I'm sure we're getting into this, and I'll tell you about another case with Bigfoot that was the case that really began to open up my eyes to what we're dealing with during that same time period. We're dealing with a phenomena that has a physical and a non-physical component to it. That's why you have physical evidence at times. And it's a very, very strange phenomenon. And I started to tell you earlier, when I got involved with Bigfoot, I always thought it was an unknown animal. And then over the years, I began to think, something's making no sense here. They see these creatures yearly, all over the United States, throughout the world, something similar. And all these years, nobody's ever come up with a body, which makes absolutely no sense. And if you like, I'll be glad to share with you the case that began to convince me that, for a lack of a better term, we're dealing with something that might be interdimensional. It, again, has a physical and a non-physical component to it, which is why there's no bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know why we can't find any. It is a mystery, isn't it? We do,
well,
we find the odd. Go on, sorry,
yes, go
Stan.
ahead, we cut that a little.
Go ahead, sorry, Stan.
No, I'm sorry. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was the fact that in some of these cases, we go out to some of these scenes. And this is still going on even in the last couple of years here in Pennsylvania. We have trails of footprints, even in fresh, heavy snow, that would suddenly stop, vanish, and disappear, which made absolutely no sense. And that still goes on over the years. And it's not just in Pennsylvania. It's throughout the country and other parts of the world. We've heard similar reports. But the case that really opened my eyes occurred February 6, 1974. And this, again, was up in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. When I talk about Fayette County, it's a very big rural, a lot of it's a rural area, a lot of woodlands, a lot of forestry areas, and a lot of history of Bigfoot, UFO sightings, and cryptids and other phenomena all through the area. And the one area in particular, a lot of incidents occur along the Chestnut Ridge. So the Chestnut Ridge is that extends through Westmoreland, where I'm at, Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County in southwest Pennsylvania, and it continues down outside of Morgantown, West Virginia, near Preston County, West Virginia. But that area, especially in the southwest PA counties, year after year is very active with Bigfoot, cryptid encounters, UFOs, other phenomena. So anyhow, so going back to this case, February 6, 1974, this is up near Ohiopyle, which is a very area that a lot of people know about. There's a lot of woodlands, a lot of resort areas up around there. Very, very nice place for swimming and rafting, things like that. Very mountainous area. That particular evening, report came in A woman lives deep in the mountains, lived in a little cabin home, had lived there for all her life. She knew animals well, pretty much didn't fear anything. She was a very good shot. It was a normal evening. She's sitting in her little cabin home, and she hears this commotion on her little front porch. She had some cans of soda, some cans of pop out there, and something was knocking the pop cans around. And a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks before, she had a pack of wild dogs that came through. And she thought, I bet you those dogs are back. And she thought in her head, I'll just scare those dogs away. I'll grab my shotgun and I'll fire over their head and I'll scare those dogs away. So she grabbed her shotgun. She loads one chamber. She walks over, hits the switch. And its arms raised up right over top of its head. And what's her reaction? She fires right into it.
Wow.
She said there's this bright flash of light, like a flash on a camera, and this huge hairy creature physically disappears right in front of her. Now, that's not the end of the story. Her in-laws, her relatives lived about 100 feet away. They heard the gunshot. They called her and asked her what she was shooting at. She tried to tell them what she had seen, and her son-in-law grabs his sidearm, his pistol, and it's a dark area, very wooded, heavily wooded. He starts walking down the path towards her home. He sees a dark figure running down the road, and he said, as he gets closer, he's surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire. He starts shooting at them randomly. He goes inside the cabin, and a short time later, they see this large, luminous object hovering over the woods like a big Christmas ornament at the same time. That's when they called the state police. Well, back at that time, here in the United States, we had a big national trucker strike. There was gas rationing going on. So I couldn't get up to the scene till the next morning. Anyhow, because there was some violence going on in different states concerning this event, the National Guard and the state police in Pennsylvania were on patrol together. Some of those men responded to this incident. I couldn't get up to the next morning, but I talked to the primary police investigator, and he said, by the time we got up there and found the place, everything was quiet, but he said something very strange happened there. That was based on the animal reactions. And I told you, I've never seen a UFO or Bigfoot myself, but I've been on the scene within minutes of some of these incidents, and I've seen the animal reactions, especially in very large, normally ferocious dogs. And this is something you cannot fabricate. I said you can fool people, but you can't fool the animals.
That's
and
true.
In many instances, when the witnesses, when the dogs are close to the Bigfoot creatures, they're like paralyzed. They don't bark, they shake, they cower, they don't make a sound. And that's very, very common. And that's what the police and those people observed, that when they got up to the scene, no sound, the dogs wouldn't move, the horses, the cattle, they were all acting strange. That's something you could not fabricate. Now, when I got up there early the next morning, everything was back to normal. The dogs were barking and everything was back to normal. But that was the case among others that were similar, that indicated to us that we're dealing with something that is not a normal flesh and blood animal. And I don't have the answers. I don't think anybody does. I think we're dealing with phenomena, and it goes much, much deeper in Bigfoot. We can talk about that. I think we're dealing with phenomena right now that is so strange and so unusual. It's far beyond our present scientific understanding right now. We're getting a lot of data on it. You know, I started investigating this back in the 70s. I started writing about it back in the 70s. And there was a lot more ridicule back in those days. But I can tell you, in more recent years, I've been in touch for years and years with many researchers throughout the country and other parts of the world. And going back even to the 70s, there were many other researchers who are aware of these type of reports with Bigfoot and UFOs seen together or some type of correlation. But many of them didn't want to talk about it. A lot of them were afraid to write about it. They weren't afraid to be laughed at and ridiculed. My position has always been, I don't have the answers. This is what we're finding. I put it out there for people to make their own judgments and have ideas about what might be going on. And these reports are continuing to happen. I can tell you, in 2018 and 2019, we had a pretty interesting surge of activity in Pennsylvania, and also around the country. I was getting other reports, but we had some of these very strange reports, more and more from the general public, reporting Bigfoot and even other cryptids with some strange elements to them. And more of this information suggests, again, we're dealing with something that has a physical and a non-physical component to it, which is why at times you might have physical evidence, but nobody's ever come up with a body. It's a very interesting phenomena and far beyond our understanding right now.
Yeah. Is there, I know you're collecting data and stuff. Is there anything that happens like on a regular basis, like yearly, monthly, things that appear all the time, every year at a certain time?
Well, it's not a certain time. I can tell you, I generally, of course, right now with the coronavirus in this area, not too many people are outside, so reports are slowing down now, even though, interestingly, the earlier months of this year were pretty steady. In March, we had some interesting reports coming in. Things are quieting down, but on a normal yearly basis before this happened, I would get reports every year, all year round, in all type of conditions. In beautiful days, during thunderstorms, during wintertime in the snow, we would get reports all year round of both Bigfoot, some cryptids, and UFOs and other phenomena. So this is something that goes on more than regularly. And, up to this point, I was giving many, many lectures locally and nationally on these topics. And everywhere I went, people would come up to me and share their personal encounters with me. Or in some cases, they would contact me later because they want to talk confidentially about it. And I'm in touch with many other researchers and other people involved in the field, and everybody's getting reports. This phenomena is so much more ongoing. It's so much more active than people realize. We have no idea how many reports are going on. I mean, it's just amazing how much is going on out there that we don't hear about.
Yeah, not just that we're not seeing, that we're just not out there to see at that time. It seems like it's constant, possibly. Can I just check if I think we can get Brent in now? Brent, do you want to try?
Yeah, Stan, hear me now?
Hi, Brent. Yes, I can hear your voice. Nice talking to you.
Oh, it's nice to talk to you as well. Thank you. I'm just absolutely thrilled by everything you're talking about. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I've got some of what you're saying. You are breaking up a little, but I can understand some of what you're saying.
I don't know why you're breaking up, Brent. I know. I'll just explain to everyone. Tried to get Brent in to co-host tonight, and I'm calling Stan through Skype, and I've tried to add Brent. We realised when we all connected, Stan couldn't hear Brent. I've now connected Brent to Skype. We can hear you all, but for some reason you're ducking in and out, Brent. I don't know what that is. Stan, what do you think it's frequencies, dimensions, these things are just disappearing, coming in and out?
Go ahead. You're cutting out a little too. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with the audio tonight. What's your feeling with the quantum side to everything? Do you think that's go on, sorry.
I can tell you this. Over the years, back probably 20, 30 years ago, people used to say to me, well, how come they only see, for example, UFO sightings in the country, in rural areas? And that is not the case at all. And in fact, what's interesting, in more recent years, we're getting more, for example, Bigfoot sightings in more populated areas, not just wooded areas. And so that's very, very interesting. But these things show up everywhere. And yes, there are certain areas. I mentioned areas along the Chestnut Ridge, along the mountain ranges. They're very active. There are many, many sightings that just happen randomly. They can happen almost anywhere. But yes, there are certain particular areas that I find is more than normal activity. So one of the primary areas, again, I talk about is along the Chestnut Ridge here in southwest PA, and especially in Westmoreland County, And just over a short distance away, over the next ridge, is the Laurel Ridge, or the Laurel Valley. And that area, again, all very active year after year, and historically, with many, many strange encounters of many types. And and then again, another phenomena, many people have heard about the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. And of course, that's getting a lot of interesting TV coverage recently here in the United States. But a lot of the similar phenomena has been was here back in the 70s. And there are other locations. I know of one that's ongoing right now at a different location that started a few years ago. And there's other places like this across the country where similar phenomena, for whatever reason, seems to suddenly begin to focus on a particular geographical area.
Portals.
And this one farming area that I'm thinking about is up in Fayette County again. And this area, when this started, there were paranormal phenomena going on. They began to hear strange screams and cries, see strange lights, find footprints, see Bigfoot, see UFOs. And numerous people, I understand even the last several months, I have visited up there and have observed some of the phenomena themselves. So sometimes these phenomena, there'll be these localized outbreaks. Sometimes the phenomena will just focus on these certain areas, and that activity go on for days, weeks, months, or years. Back, if I recall, 1979, December of 1979, and on the border of Westmore and Armstrong County here in southwest Pennsylvania, again, a rural area, one afternoon, an object reportedly fell from the sky into a wooded area. Soon after, the people in the area began to hear cries and howls and see Bigfoot and strange creatures and UFOs, and this went on for two to 3 years, and it made a lot of local and national news. And here's something a lot of people aren't aware of. There's a whole series of very strange phenomena that I've uncovered about Bigfoot. I have a whole lecture I do on it, and it's something that many people never heard of before, and many others may know about it, many in the field, but they don't want to discuss it because it's so strange and unusual. But for example, with that particular outbreak, and there's other since in other parts of the country, you've had this. Sometimes when you have a localized outbreak of Bigfoot sightings in a certain area, sometimes other cryptids will also show up at the same time. So, for example, with that case, we had reports of black panthers being reported. And I know you have many in the UK, those type of reports as well. And I've investigated many, many of these sightings of black panthers. And some of those things that I found out of black panthers are very, very strange and similar to what I found out about Bigfoot. There's a lot more to a lot of this phenomena than anybody realizes. It's much stranger, and believe me, these are not details I was out looking for. These were things that, after you interviewed multitudes of independent people who didn't know each other from widespread areas, who were reluctant to even tell you things, and they come up with these little details. And it was so amazing in so many of the cases I worked on, how different people would confirm other people's accounts without knowing them. And that's what gives it a lot of clarity, the fact that there's something going on out there.
Yeah. I mean, we hear all sorts of reports, don't we? Like you say, there's the standard Bigfoot flesh and blood encounters that seem very cut and dry, that this is just a real live creature with flesh and blood. Do you think the ones that seem to be associated to these UFO orbs, lights, do you think they're not Bigfoot? They may be portraying to be a Bigfoot. Basically, do you think they're alien and there's other kinds of Bigfoot that are more organic?
Well, once again, there's many questions that I don't have the answers for either. And, when I started looking back in the 70s at all these reports coming in, all these Bigfoot sightings, and I go into great detail about it in my Solid Invasion book, I talk in great detail about all these strange cases, but many of the Bigfoot sightings back then were your typical, so-called typical Bigfoot reports, but there were a few variations. Some were taller and thinner, some were shorter and more muscular, and we had some incidents that some people might call these dogman sightings today. I mean, we had some incidents back then where people, when I say 2 or 3 feet away. They were that close, right in the face of these things. I had one incident, and there was more than one, but I had one incident out in the country, and early morning, around 3 o'clock in the morning, the location, this was a woman visiting friends, and the house was a very low foundation to the ground. And early morning, she went into the restroom, and she was sitting there. So she's sitting there right there in front of the window. She starts hearing these strange sounds, animal sounds of something outside. And a short time later, this thing literally rises up, and the face of this thing is looking directly in the window, right into her face. She described in great detail a hairy, more wolf-like face, fang-like teeth, luminous, glowing, reddish-orange eyes. And I can tell you, she was pretty much hysterical. She ran out of there. They called the police. The police connected her to me. A police officer went out, found some 3-toed footprints out there, similar to what I had been finding. And here's another aspect of the story. Another thing is very rarely you hear about, and I don't have a lot of reports like this, but I've heard other accounts. She was so frightened, she made those people take her from their home to her home several miles away. Within the hour, the same or a similar creature showed up at her house.
Wow.
And that's something a lot of people have never heard of before. I cannot answer, are these the same creatures? I don't know. I question, why have no bodies ever been found? But I have many reports of Bigfoot. And again, it's not just my reports. There's others I'm aware of from many researchers throughout the country and other parts of the world, where these things sometimes are not completely physical. Sometimes only part of the body is solid. Sometimes they're misty or shimmery. I've had cases where these things would run, and they would suddenly disappear and reappear somewhere else on the opposite side or behind some rock formation, then disappear again. I had 2 people had an incident. This was last year, in 2019, early in the year, as I recall, and these people didn't even want to call and report it, and they reported to a relative who contacted me, and then finally I was able to interview the one witness who wanted nothing to do with it. And this very credible family going to work early morning, and this huge hair-covered Bigfoot suddenly appears right in front of the vehicle, got a clear look at this thing, and she said it was like watching a Predator movie. She said, this huge, hairy thing, I see it from head to toe, it suddenly appears out of nowhere, it walks in front of the car, and it's gone. And that's what we've heard in so many reports. They're here and they're gone, they appear and disappear. And I don't recommend people shooting at these things, but over the years I've had people shoot at these things with all type of weapons. Nobody ever brought one down. Well, they brought them down to the degree that sometimes they would fall down and get back up and walk off, or sometimes they would physically disappear. There was another case up in Fayette County years ago again, where a fellow was walking his hunting dogs at night on his property. It was getting dark, and ahead of him, he sees this dark figure ahead of him, and he's yelling at him, "What you doing trespassing on my property?" And the guy didn't respond. As he's getting closer, he realizes it's a tall, hair-covered creature, and he grabs his pistol, starts shooting at it, and he said, "I know I hit it." And he said, "It physically disappeared in front of me. I could still hear it running, but you couldn't see it anymore." These are the kind of things that go on you just don't hear about. But there's many others. Nick Redfern, I'm sure you recognize his name. He's from the UK. He's here in the U.S. He's investigated many similar accounts, and there's many other researchers who know about these accounts.
Yeah, it's there's so much people aren't telling us as well, like you say, with the ridicule and everything. Not everybody wants to disclose the things that are happening to them because they kind of sound crazy enough as it is, you know.
Right.
What about abductees or missing time? Do you hear a lot about that?
Okay, and I'll remind me to tell you that, but before I get off of that, there's many other creatures I investigate, not just Bigfoot, not just the Black Panthers, but there's many other cryptid reports that we're getting. And again, these come in from people from all walks of life. The other thing is very fascinating are what we call the Thunderbird sightings. These are reports of these huge flying creatures. And again, it's very difficult to judge altitude and size, just like with a UFO sighting. But in some of these cases, these huge almost like huge overgrown turkey vultures, generally dark brown or black. But we're talking a wingspan of 10 to 20 feet in some cases. In some cases, these birds were very low to the ground or actually on the ground. And we have incidents where they were eating roadkill on the road, and they were blocking cars from passing. So people got a very good look at them. And there was one case back a number of years ago, I interviewed a man. This was a neighboring West Virginia, outside of Pennsylvania. It was early morning. It was a 2-lane farm road. And the guy's going down the road. He had to hit his brakes very hard because here's this huge, giant bird, 4.5 feet tall, eating roadkill. And this thing was so big, it was hopping from one leg to the other, trying to flap its wings to get off the ground. It could barely move. It was so huge. And he could see the wingtips on both. The wings were extended to cover both sides of the highway. And when it was flapping its wings, the dust and dirt was going up, and he could see the end of the wings. And he went back the next day to measure the width. It was 21 feet across. And, I mean, those are the kind of cases. And these reports are ongoing even this year. These things go on year after year. We're getting these reports. And what's so fascinating, when I interview the people who've seen these things, and other things we'll talk about too, there is more mystery to them. The whole point is this. You've got all these strange creatures being seen. Well, it's no possible way that we can have so many type of unknown creatures out there, yet so many credible people who don't know each other, who want no publicity, are reporting something similar. So we've got to be dealing with something that we just don't understand right now. And once again, I've seen more and more data that suggests that some of these creatures have that physical and non-physical component to them, which is why you may have physical evidence at the scene at times, but you never find any bodies. And there's some strange things going on out there. And another thing that we're getting more reports on, and I understand across the country here in the United States, over the last year, more reports like this are coming in. Some people call it the rake. There's different names for it. I don't like to give names to these things, but I may have heard some of these reports maybe many years ago, but this started here in my general area in the fall of 2017. And actually, the first report I got was from a police officer who was on patrol and it came across whatever this thing was. He called me a short time later. And he was out on patrol in the area that he commonly rode through. And he sees what appears to be a ball of light on the road. And he's thinking, I've never seen any artificial lighting or anything like that on the road. So he slows down and he says, suddenly this ball of light suddenly rises up from the ground. And he soon realizes that what he's seeing is the weirdest thing he's ever seen. It's actually a head of a very strange being that was about 6.5 feet tall. Wow. It was tall and almost skeletal thin. And he said this thing was, the head was about 8 to 10 inches in diameter, shaped kind of like a ball. The head was just a ball of light, kind of egg-shaped possibly. The light from it was a dull white. The light illuminated the shoulders, the top of the chest, and section of the arms. He could not see the hands. The chest was about 18 inches across. The waist appeared to be small, but the arms were unusually long. The long limbs looked skeletal with no muscle mass. The skin tone was almost kind of a dull grayish blue. And the thing turned, and he said, I've never seen anything move so quickly in my life. He said, I assumed it was ran on legs, but I couldn't see at that point from where he said it was there and it was gone. I mean, it's interesting. And some of the witnesses use almost the same wording of different phenomena. They're seeing different cryptids. It's suddenly there and suddenly gone. Well, interestingly, I think it was about 2 to 3 weeks later, I get another report, probably 20, 30 miles from there, of another person didn't knowing about this, who said a similar creature came up out of the woods, came within 30 feet of that person. Then other reports began to come in from other areas. And back, let me see now, this would have been October, November, I believe, of 2018, probably, I guess, 35, 40 miles outside of Pittsburgh in a rural area. And here's a fellow that lives in the woods, familiar with the woods, knows the deer and the animals up there. He was up there that evening, started hearing some odd sounds and something walking, and the walking did not sound like deer. And he became a little frightened and decided he didn't know what it was. So he went down to his house. He's sitting there at the table in the kitchen. 10 feet away is this big glass back door. There's no drapes, nothing obstructing it. And here's this same kind of creature, skeletal thin, humanoid, but with luminous, glowing yellow eyes, crouched down at the door, staring right into his face 10 feet away. And then it crouched down and scampered around the house and went back up into the woods. Other reports similar have been coming in. And I've talked to numerous other witnesses and other researchers who are getting similar reports around the country. There's a lot of very strange things going on out there.
That's incredible. How
Can I
sorry.
Does Stan think it's possible that the rake is just a rebranding of the old tools?
Of the old.
I'm sorry, I heard him say something about the rake, but I couldn't understand it.
Is it a rebrand? I don't know what you said. It's a rebranding of, Brent. What did you think it was a rebranding of?
Well, are the rakes that we call today, is that just a new name for the tools that have been talked about forever?
Brent's asking if you think using the term rake is just kind of like a rebranding for all the other things that we've seen over the years. Do the names change for things? What defines a rake to you?
Well, again, I don't like to use. That's what some people refer to it as, and I've seen that mentioned different places talking about something that's humanoid, skeletal thin, long limbs. I don't really like to use that term, but on some of the radio shows I've been on recently, people brought up that terminology. There's some regional names they give here in the country for some of these things, but I'm just describing as what people are seeing. And that's why I don't like to use the terms. But once again, there's all kinds of strange things being seen out there. Another thing that's very popular, well, I can't say popular, but it's happened here in the United States, and we've had some cases in Pennsylvania. And the one particular creature that has become known as the Butler gargoyle, and Butler is a county north of Pittsburgh, where, again, a lot of activity up in those areas for a lot of strange things. I've been up there. I was up there in the 1960s investigating Bigfoot, rather UFO sightings and humanoid kind of reports they are getting, and a lot of UFO activity. And there have been many Bigfoot sightings in more recent years up in those areas as well. And so you've got a lot of strange things up in that area. But this particular case, this was a fellow, a very credible businessman. I've got to know him and his family very, very well. And this occurred March 18th of 2011. It was on a rural road in Butler County, and the fellow's riding down the road, and suddenly in his headlights to the right of him in a field in the grassy area, he sees something moving. He thought it was a deer lying in the ground. And suddenly it rises up from the ground, and this thing walks in front of like a big road sign, and it's at least 8 feet tall. And it takes 3 big steps. He only sees it from the left side, as I recall. It never looked towards him, and it walks off into the woods. And when I got to interview him, he said, I hear people talking about Bigfoot. He said, this thing was not a Bigfoot. He said, yeah, it's at least 8 feet tall, but he said it's covered with smooth, leather-like skin, kind of a dark tan or light brown color. And the head was kind of flat in the front and rounded out, kind of like an aerodynamic helmet that people use for bike riding. The face was flat. The eyes were not clearly defined, but he seemed to be pointed in the corner. The arms were muscular and a little longer than that of a human. There were claws for fingers. The one thing that stood out were the legs. The legs, he said, were extremely muscular, but he said they didn't move like normal human legs. They looked like they bent backwards, and there were wings on its back that were tucked into its body. And he said this thing was just incredible. Well, interestingly, the local group up there, the local research group, the BORU group up in Butler, within days had several other similar reports in the same general area. And some of them were very, very interesting. Let me see. I may have a copy of one of the reports here. Here, I can tell you, the one from up around Reimersburg, PA, and during that same time period, these witnesses are riding down the road near an ice cream stand with came within 35 feet of this creature. 9 feet tall, had dark brown skin, long arms and broad shoulders, had a pointed head, the flat forehead, pointed ears, and what appeared to be wings on its back. Body was extremely muscular. There were 4 finger-like claws in each hand. The eyes were squinted and swept upward in the corner. The creature turned, the whole body would turn. The movement of the arms were not normal. The mouth looked like a slit. The wings looked like see-through mesh and resembled wings on a bat. The claws were black as coal. The witness stated this thing was straight from hell.
Wow.
This strange stuff.
How do these people deal with these experiences? Do you know? Do you pass them on to other people, or have you seen the effects of the PTSD people experience seeing this crazy stuff?
I've been dealing with the public by thousands of people, and tremendous number of cases since my hotline's been open. In 1969, when I started, as I mentioned, it never stops ringing. I mean, calls come in, and again, now things have quieted down a little because of the virus situation, but normally calls come in on a regular basis, or email reports come in, and I deal with this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And I've talked multitudes of people. I mean, people from all walks of life, women, children, police officers, educators, hunters, all kind of people whose lives are dramatically changed by these experiences. Many of these people never believed any of these things could exist that I had their own personal encounter. Many of them were very skeptical. And many of these people's lives have been dramatically changed. I mean, some of these people from 20, 30 years ago, I'm still in touch with. And their lives have been completely changed because of this. Some of them still can't deal with the fact that they encountered something that's not supposed to exist. I can tell you about, losing track of time, about 2 years ago or so, I interviewed several different hunters who didn't know each other independently. Told me how they lived in the woods, they loved the woods, they'd be out there all the time, and now they won't go back in the woods anymore because of the creatures they encountered and the screams and cries they heard. They were unbelievable, and their lives had completely changed. You asked about abduction cases. I was one of the first in the country to investigate an alleged abduction case back in the 1960s.
Right.
And that's when I told you I had my research team started in 1970, but I was working with another group, and they were getting some reports, but later my groups we got involved in a lot of cases that had occurred in the 60s and in the 70s. And I mean, we could spend just full-time work on those cases because some of them are so involved. You can spend months and years on one case, which we were not able to do. I mean, we all did this out of our own time and pocket. We all had full-time jobs. We had reports coming in all the time from across the state. And I mean, we could only do the best we could. But I cannot say that these people were abducted by visitors from another planet, but I can tell you some of these are very credible people, and something happened to them that affected their lives. And I remember one case that some people in my group were involved with. It was another county far from me, but I did get up one time to interview the key witness, and just from memory from so many years ago, this was a young fellow. And this UFO would apparently land in the middle of the night around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And he would awaken and walk out into the woods and supposedly go aboard this craft. And there were different types of biological experimentations being done on him. And the one thing that stood out when I interviewed him, he talked about these small little humanoid creatures. And this was long before there was much publicity whatsoever about these cases in the news. And he described them, and he said they looked like a Pillsbury Doughboy. And that always stuck with me in my memory because it was such a very interesting description of what some of the people described the grays later on, the small humanoids that people reported. And I can tell you in the 1960s, especially the late 60s in Pennsylvania, there were multitudes of cases of very large battleship gray, solid metallic objects, many with portals or windows in them very close to the ground. In some cases, people could see what looked like computers or panels of equipment through the portals, or see figures moving around. And there were reports of landing cases where the small humanoids would be seen. Some were small humanoids, some were more human-like looking, as I recall. And one fascinating case, one of my cases always stuck out in my mind, one of the better cases, was February of 1968. Unfortunately, both of these brothers are now deceased. The younger brother was a firm believer in UFOs. The older brother was completely skeptical, didn't believe in them, and those brothers would get so emotionally upset over UFOs, they would get into fistfights over UFOs. So the older brother goes into the U.S. Navy, gets a very high-level security clearance, works on one of our most advanced aircraft carriers, and worked with the most advanced aircraft we had. So he knew everything we had at the time. So in February 68, he comes out of the Navy, he gets married. Him and his new wife rent a small little farmhouse out in this area, out in Westmoreland County. And it's a February afternoon. He heard on news it's going to start snowing. He happens to look out the window to check the weather, and about 50 feet away, and about 50 feet off the ground, is this huge metallic dome-shaped object with portals and a catwalk hovering right over the top of the pond. It's making no sound. He calls his wife. She gets very, very upset. They both stand outside looking at this thing, and these two small humanoid figures come out on the catwalk of the object like they're communicating, and one of them looks directly at the couple. At that point, it starts to snow a little heavier. His wife goes in, calls the fellow's brother, who was a UFO believer, and his wife, and they make the trip about 12 miles away, come out to see the object. He said is still there. By the time they get there, it's still there, but it's starting to snow pretty heavily, and the roads are getting slippery. But this thing is now about 100 feet off the ground, so it's very low. And as they walk, it suddenly ascends into the heavens, looks like a red star going across the sky, and it's gone.
Wow.
And they called the local airport to report it, and they said, you're one of many people calling and reporting seeing something similar. Well, that fellow who was in the Navy, who knew about everything we had, became a firm believer. And like he said to me, he said, if I hadn't seen it myself, nobody could ever have convinced me.
Yeah.
So this is what's going on. And I'll give you another element that's very, because what I started doing years and years and years ago, I started to try to study the background of people having these experiences. And again, same situation. Didn't have any funding, had so many reports going on, working full time, had lots of people in my groups. And so we did the best we could. But there was one person who I'm still in touch with today. Back many years ago, so probably back in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, can't remember exactly at this point. She was a young child that had disappeared, was missing. There was a big widespread search for her in those areas, in the area where it happened. By the way, it's an area that historically has had an ongoing history of UFO sightings and Bigfoot encounters and other phenomena. They searched and searched, and they found her standing in the middle of the field, had no idea she was missing, said she'd been there the whole time. Well, from the time she was little, she began to have paranormal experiences. She had UFO sightings throughout her life. She had later, and as time went on, she had Bigfoot encounters, other cryptid encounters. Her husband did, her children did, and then later her grandchildren did. So it went from her to her children to her grandchildren, and even in more recent months, they're still having experiences. So some of these people, and I've interviewed many, many people with similar backgrounds. In fact, it's amazing because I know what some of these people are going to tell me before they even tell me because of the patterns. Yeah. And so many of these people, from the time they're very little, they have these experiences throughout their lives.
Oh, it's incredible, isn't it? And this, I've heard again of families that it seems to be a generational thing. It happens to the next generation, and you have to wonder what's the common denominator. Are certain people open to these experiences and some others aren't? Is there a reason why it happens to some people? Go on. Sorry.
Here's what I started to find. One, sometimes it's just a random phenomenon. People are at the right place at the right time, and that's it. They never see anything again. But certain people may have more than one experience throughout their life. And from what I started to find out was there was indication that, one, certain people may have certain abilities that other people did not, and they may have been able to perceive some phenomena that other people couldn't, or the phenomena was attracted to them. Mm-hmm. And I had incidents years and years ago where, for example, there'd be a group of people, and only certain people within the group could see the UFO hovering overhead, and the other people couldn't see it.
Right.
So it may well be that certain people had certain abilities that they're able to perceive this phenomena where other people cannot see it or experience it.
Yeah. I've just remembered now, Stan, when we talked the other day, you told me to remind you about telepathy, a story about telepathy, because we touched on mind speak. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes. Yeah, I do. You know, I told you about the fact that I found many, many very strange different aspects of the Bigfoot phenomenon, something that a lot of people don't know about or don't talk about it. And this is something that is extremely rare in the cases I worked on, the hundreds of cases, very few cases where this came up. And now I know in other parts of the country, there are other people who claim that they have more than, they have some telepathic communication with a Bigfoot.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been skeptical, but I can tell you there was one instance that I was a witness to. I was there when the prediction was made, and it occurred the next day. And this occurred back in the 1980s. This would have been in the Westmoreland County area near the Chestnut Ridge along that border where, again, many, many Bigfoot reports, even in the last few months, we've had reports of tracks around almost every year. We get Bigfoot sightings around Derry Township, along the Chestnut Ridge in Westmoreland County. And my team had been called out there because some people had claimed that this Bigfoot would be seen along the base of the ridge out around where they were living, was coming down close to their properties. So we went out to interview some of these people. Very credible people, had nothing to gain, of course didn't want their names used. And one of them reluctantly indicated that this person felt that the creature was mentally trying to communicate. And while we were there, this person said the creature is communicating that tomorrow morning, the next morning, over a little town called Homer City, which would be about 15 miles away in another county, up in Indiana County, that the next morning there would be a UFO incident over that area.
Wow.
Interestingly, the next morning, multiple reports of this very strange, high-pitched sound over Homer City, PA. I mean, it was so unusual that the police and the fire departments were called out. And I even have a newspaper clipping from it. And they never were able to determine what it was. There was no aircraft in the area. Nobody knew what it was. And I found that was extremely interesting because it was documented.
Yeah. This is the thing, isn't it? We're left with more questions than finding answers with these things. What do you feel about the this is a question from Brent, actually, the different shapes of the UFOs? Do you think they represent anything, as in other races, or I don't know what, different places?
Well, you know, as I talked about earlier, when I first began to this, everything back in the 60s, the 70s, everything was that these things are spacecraft from another planet. They're extraterrestrial. And again, I keep an open mind, all possibilities, and maybe a certain percentage, maybe they are. But more and more indications to me is that we're dealing with more than one origin for the unknown category. Maybe some are unknown natural phenomena. What if some are time travelers? But once again, even with certain types of UFOs, and it's hard to say which is which, and I'll explain why in a minute, but these things, again, maybe for a lack of a better term, interdimensional. They have a physical and non-physical component to them. I have many incidents, even the last couple of years in Diggerlight, of large structured objects that suddenly begin to vanish and disappear. Sometimes they suddenly appear out of nowhere. They physically change form and they're gone. And that's what's going on for years and years there. It's amazing. And something that I started investigating back in the 60s that a lot of people weren't aware of. I've called them mini UFOs for many, many years. And these objects, whatever they are, they come very close to people, don't seem to hurt them in any way. They're generally only a few inches, about a foot or two in diameter, generally spherical, but not always. Sometimes it's just various light sources of different colors, sometimes a solid and metallic. What's interesting, these small little objects, sometimes they'll enter through open windows, they'll enter people's homes or cars or vehicles, and they'll float around, they'll go back out. many years ago. You may have heard about what they call Punxsutawney Phil in the wintertime that gives an idea how the winter's going to be here in the United States. It's a big national interesting topic that people discuss. So anyhow, up in Punxsutawney, years ago, I remember interviewing a lady and told me she was in her kitchen cooking. She had a window open. One of these little spheres floats in. It's floating around the kitchen, flying over top of her head. She grabs her broom, begins to strike it. She said it broke into two identical little spheres. They floated around, went back out the window, and they were gone.
Wow. So
there's many accounts of these small little spherical things. And interestingly, one of my associate researchers, Jim Brown, up in Fayette County again, we talked about earlier, he had a very interesting incident up in that area. And I can't remember all the details, but it happened last year. And I believe it was kind of towards the end of the year. And a man's riding down the road to his home. And actually, hold on, I think I may have a copy of the report here. Yeah. Let's see. So let me see. This was November 2019. He's riding down across the road. And as he's approaching over top of a hill, he sees this ball in the road just sitting there. It says about 2 feet across, blocking the road. And he said, I couldn't get around it to get through the road. So he said, I got out of my vehicle and I saw it began to move slowly towards it. And I thought about picking it up because it was so strange. And he said, but when I opened the car door, it started to just suddenly fade away and disappear. He said it took a few seconds to vanish, but then it just disappeared and gone. It never moved. It just faded away. He closed the door and he went on his road, went on the way. So that's what's going on. There's many different elements of these reports that a lot of people are not aware of.
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? I've just got a question from the chat, and just in my head, it's just come to me. Are orbs little UFOs? Is that what these little orbs are that we see? Are they little aliens visiting us, or you know?
Well, they appear to be intelligently controlled. I mean, a theory years and years ago was that they could be some type of remote control device, just like we have drones today. They've been seeing these things for years and years. Maybe there's something that monitors our activity. We don't know. Mm-hmm. Once again, some are just light sources. Sometimes they're solid spheres. I've had reports of them in people's homes and going right through the walls of the house. I had the case up near Penn State in beautiful afternoon several years ago. A guy's riding in his truck, big truck, going at pretty good speed down the highway. He had his passenger window down. Here's one of these small spheres pacing his truck. It enters the cab of his truck. It floats all around. It floats right up to his leg. It goes out through the bed of the truck and disappears.
Wow.
And so I think these cases, again, are more common than people realize. And here's another facet that's interesting. In more recent years, Bigfoot investigators all across the country, including Pennsylvania, more and more many reports from what I'm hearing. These fellows are going out investigating Bigfoot, looking for Bigfoot. They're not seeing Bigfoot, but they're coming back reporting these strange orbs of light or other strange light phenomena. And that's something that's definitely going on in a lot of areas. So we're hearing more and more people in the Bigfoot field who are skeptical of these kind of reports are now beginning to look into it more and more. They're not laughing as much as they used to because they're hearing more about it. Some of them are experiencing some of these phenomena, and they're beginning to ask the same question I did years ago: where's the bodies if these are normal flesh and blood animals? There's something else involved.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel like that. It's just such a strange, how this creature can be so elusive and yet, do the things it does just doesn't make sense. Let me ask you this question, Stan, because we've got one from the chat. Stan, are you familiar with the Tic Tac UFO patent that was applied for on the April 28th, 2016 by the US Navy?
Yeah, well, the Tic Tac configuration they're talking about. I think more and more people, they're really describing something that's more elongated, kind of more of a cigar-shaped phenomena. And I've had multitudes of these reports. What's interesting is the news is focusing on these news reports, which are very interesting and they're important because of the fact that you have trained observers who are encountering these things, but it's been going on for years and years. It's not a new phenomenon whatsoever. And I mean, personnel, I've interviewed over the years many former Navy and Air Force and Coast Guard and Army personnel who've encountered these things years and years ago. And it's an ongoing phenomena. And the cigar-shaped objects, triangular objects, more recent years getting more reports of these large, solid, rectangular objects being reported. But the cigar-shaped objects are very, very common, many in daylight, even again in recent years. One of my favorite cases I worked on, September 3rd, 1987. And this was only miles from where I live on a very busy 4-lane major highway, Route 30. There was a big mall on the roadway in the area where it happened. At the time it happened, there were multiple witnesses, including law enforcement. Early that evening, many people see this maybe 300-foot long, solid, cigar-shaped object, elliptical object with multiple lights on it, making no sound, came across a road, went right over top of the high-tension power lines, crossed the road where there was a power substation. So this thing is about 300 feet off the ground, about 300 feet in length. This huge solid object moving across the highway, it turns vertical in the sky, this huge object, and at the same time it does that, all the power in the area went out.
Wow.
When the engineers went out to behind the mall to investigate to see what happened, they found all three of the master fuses in the circuit had been blown. Apparently something is just unheard of. And I said years and years ago, and here's another pattern I found. Many low-level, close-range, low-level UFO encounters, and many encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids commonly occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. So many sightings around high-tension power lines, power plants, gas lines, radio towers, railroad tracks, all type of energy connection. You look into the reports where these things happen, and quite often you're going to find there's definitely an energy connection to the phenomena we're dealing with.
A build-up, maybe. It seems that sometimes with hauntings, it's a build-up of energy before something happens. And
yes,
I wonder if that's how it's working in that way. I've got another question from the chat. Have you ever met any MIBs or seen them or had any kind of connection with them?
I've had some very important cases I worked on over many, many years. And in some of these cases, there was suggestion that possibly some government agencies were involved in them as well. But I can tell you, during that 1973 Bigfoot outbreak that we talked about earlier, there was a huge amount of interest by the public and different sources in general. Among the strange things that happened, and some of these kind of fit in the category you're asking me about. One, I received a phone call from a person who told me they worked for the government. They were very interested in the research I was doing on Bigfoot. I was given the name of a contact in a laboratory in Washington, D.C., and a phone number in the event that we came up with a body or anything significant for me to contact them. And later I was contacted by some official government personnel, some representatives, people who worked for another government representative who came to visit me. And they were very, very positive, very professional, very supportive of what I was doing. Kept contact with them for quite a while. And I gave them the phone number I was given, and they confirmed it was an internal government number. And you remember the case we talked about, that amazing UFO Bigfoot case where the UFO was on the ground and the two Bigfoot were there and a man shot at him and the craft disappeared? Okay, well, in some incidents when there were very important incidents, I would make it a part of the policy. We would try to keep in touch with those people and have periodic meetings with those people. And years after that happened, one of my associates and I went up to interview him. We never used hypnosis on him. There was some reasons why we didn't do it, and we had never done it at that point, and we are just thinking many years later of that possibility. So we met with the witness, and we told him what we wanted to do, and he looked at us very strange. He said, well, why do you want to hypnotize me again? We said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, yeah. He said, some of your guys came up and hypnotized me. He said, we never hypnotized you. He went to tell us a story that maybe a week or two or so after it happened, and we've been up there numerous times interviewing him and checking out the area and whatever. And this was something we never heard of before. He said, these two fellows came to interview him again. First time he'd ever seen these two. One was in a dark suit. One was in an Air Force uniform. The man in the Air Force uniform had a briefcase. And they wanted to interview him. They wanted him to tell them everything he could remember about the UFO and the Bigfoot that he had seen in the field that night. And the man opened up his briefcase and took out photographs of UFOs and Bigfoot. And I remember one, he told me it was a particular picture, I believe it was taken in Georgia, of a Bigfoot climbing over a fence with a dead pig under its arm. And they wanted to know if it looked similar to what he saw. And then apparently they did hypnotize him, and they told him they would be in touch, and that was the last he ever saw them. And of course, we tried to track it down. You got to remember now, that happened in 1973.
Okay.
And it was years later we found out about it. But the Air Force had officially dropped Project Blue Book, closed it down in January of 1970. So the Air Force officially was not supposed to be involved in UFO research. Whoever those men were, we never found out. And then there were other cases that I had too, where some mystery men showed up. There were significant cases where there was some possible physical evidence involved. So a lot of these cases, by the way, are in my books. I believe you can get them in the UK. I think it's AmazonUK.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
Okay.
I am not able to ship from the United States over there, unfortunately.
All right. I'll put some links up. But your books are Silent Invasion, The Pennsylvania UFO, Bigfoot Casebook, Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures. Quite a few to go out.
And my website is stangordon.info, I-N-F-O, StanGordon.info. There's a lot of interesting information on there.
I'm going to put that up in the chat now for everyone to go over and check that out. I've got a couple more questions if you're all right. Are you still all right for a little bit of time, Stan?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Cool. I've got one from Diana. I've lost it now, but she wants to know if you had any connections with MUFON.
I was probably the youngest and the longest MUFON state director for many, many years, back in the 70s and 80s. So, yeah, back then I've not been involved with any organizational groups as such in years past. Since about November of 93, I think it was. I've been working as an independent researcher, but I keep in contact with many other people in research groups and many other investigators. I haven't had my group for many, many years. I had them for numerous years. A lot of the people who were involved with me, unfortunately, have now passed away. They're very elderly, but I still have many contacts out there that can go out and follow up on cases. But many years ago, I was involved with MUFON, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. What's the scariest investigation that you've had? What's really made your what's really made your skin crawl, or the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and go, that's just too much?
Well, there were so many, but I think probably that case I talked about where the creature vanished and disappeared when the lady shot at it. I mean, that was significant. And again, there were other cases like that I've later heard about. And that was the case that really made me realize that we're dealing with something that's not a normal flesh and blood animal. There's something else going on. And of course, that famous case up in Fayette County, up outside of Uniontown, there's a lot more to that story we didn't get into. The whole story is in the Silent Invasion book, probably one of the strangest, weirdest cases ever documented. And there are so many. I mean, I couldn't even begin to tell you about the case I've been involved in. There are so many reports that are so strange and unusual.
Yeah.
And you just never know what the next call is going to be that comes in. But this thing that these people were seeing, this tall, skinny humanoid creature that are being reported, that's kind of fascinating and quite unusual. And again, so many cases, even in recent years, of people being very close to these creatures, even in daylight. And we're talking, many of the TV shows you used to see on TV with Bigfoot, people see a shadowy figure in the dark, half a mile away or, a great distance away, and you can't tell. But a lot of the reports we're getting, people are close enough, they're seeing these things from head to toe. They're describing the facial features on it. I mean, I had one Bigfoot sighting, probably one of the best in years, and this was outside of Pittsburgh in what we call the Mon Valley area. And the Mon Valley are these small little communities that parallel along the Monongahela River. And again, during the 70s, a lot of Bigfoot activity around there, still continues to be. Thunderbird sightings in recent years, Panthers reports, strange creatures in the water, water monsters being reported in some of the lakes and rivers in Pennsylvania. But anyhow, this was November of 2018. Very rainy night. I remember that night it was just pouring down rain. This fellow is riding down this 2-lane farm road and comes around the bend, comes down on the stretch, and about 50 feet away, his low beams run. He sees what appears to be somebody or something standing on the left side of the road. He slowly moves closer, puts his high beams on, and this huge, at least 7 foot tall, huge hair-covered Bigfoot literally walks out onto the road, 5 feet in front of his car, stands there in the middle of the road with glowing red eyes staring into his face.
Wow.
And it's so close at that point, he can't see the bottom of his legs and arms because it's so close to the vehicle. And it turns sideways, moves sideways, and begins to take these long strides and leaps across the road from left to right and goes up this little hill. And he can see its long arm swinging. So he grabs his cell phone, starts following it up on this little road, gets ready to take a picture, and he said, "It's gone. Here we go again." He said, "It was right in front of me in the headlights. I know it's dark, it's raining, but it was so big." And he said, "I go to take a picture. It's gone. It's not there anymore." And I mean, I was up there the next day with Eric Altman, another well-known researcher. We went out to interview him, poured all night, no evidence of anything, covered with leaves. But this fella, I mean, he was very, very emotional, very, very shook up, but gave one of the best descriptions I've heard in years from head to toe.
Wow.
And he said it's covered with shaggy brown and black hair. But here was an interesting thing. Rarely do you hear about, we've had other reports over the years. He said this thing looked like it was unhealthy and it was sickly. And he said there were patches of hair missing on the body like it had mange. And he went to describe the head down to the nose. He saw the hands, the hair on the chest. He said the hands are about twice the size of a human. They were brown in color, and they were kind of cupped, as I believe. They're kind of being held in and closed. But he gave a very, very detailed account from head to toe what this thing looked like. But here again, you've got that strange element. Where did it go? And that's what we're getting from so many different people.
Yeah. You've collected such an enormous amount of reports, haven't you? I don't know, are you remembering them all, to be honest? But so much detailed information that you've got. Go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you work, someone's asking Donald, did you work on the Bear Road incident in Whitehall, New York?
No, I know other people did. I'm so busy just in Pennsylvania. I focus mainly on Pennsylvania, but I'm aware of a lot of reports from other states, and I'm in contact with a lot of people who have researched some of those cases over the years. I know a lot of the well-known investigators you probably have heard about from around the country. But I focus mainly on Pennsylvania because there's so much going on here all the time. It's generally nonstop. Yeah.
Where do you think we'll ever have these answers? Where do you think this is all going? Do you think anything's evolved since you've been studying this and getting your reports?
I think that right now we're dealing with a phenomena that is far beyond our present scientific understanding and research. And I believe someday we're going to have the instrumentation, the technology to detect a lot of this phenomena. I mean, look at what we have today. I mean, look at the change in instrumentation. I mean, back when I had my groups back in the 70s, we couldn't get night vision equipment, so we had to build our own. And so you just look at the technology, the instruments and detect heat, for example, which we can't see with the eyes, but with the instrumentation we can. And of course, we know there's different things that the animals are able to detect. But I think someday we're going to have the technology to give us a much better idea of the phenomenon we're dealing with. Don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, but I think someday down the road we'll have a lot more answers to what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I guess, even aside from all the tech and equipment, it's about, are we going to be able to communicate? That's the next step, isn't it? Are people actually communicating with these beings? People saying there have been connections, kind of relations with Bigfoot. It's just another question. It's just another question.
Yeah, well, again, there's so much we don't understand or don't know.
Yeah.
And again, we talked about the telepathic aspect of it. And again, in the case that I worked on, extremely rare. Hardly anybody talks about it. And the few people told me about it did it so reluctantly they didn't want to share it with me. But I understand some parts of the country that's much more common. It's not where I'm at. But again, there's so much we don't know about the Bigfoot phenomena. It's just amazing. I mean, I have a list and list of some of the oddities we've come up with Bigfoot, and it's things that most people would never even hear about. And so it just fascinates me when I talk to all these different people who don't know each other. They're not in the field. They're just the general public. And when they bring up these certain details, they tell me the same thing. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. What do your police officer friends say about? Let's talk about maybe cover-ups. Do they ask people in higher office what's going on, or are they told to just not say anything? What's your feedback off those people?
Well, again, it's varied over the years. Again, when I had my groups back in the 70s, we were getting a lot of referrals from a lot of law enforcement people, and I get reports from many different inputs in different places, and I'm not aware of any kind of policy. A lot of police officers have seen things, and a lot of them over the years it went public, which I was surprised that some of the police departments released some of the information they did publicly, which I wasn't even aware of. But each case is different. I can tell you, many of the police officers and other officials I've interviewed who have seen things, 99.9% want no publicity whatsoever. And in some cases, they may or may not have made a report on it because they know what they were dealing with. It was something very unusual. And so a lot of times they didn't want to go public with it or talk about it.
Yeah, that's understandable, isn't it, I guess? I've got one last question here. Does there seem to be any hotspots around the country, and do you have any ideas why some areas are more active than others?
Can you repeat that again? I lost some of what you asked me.
I think actually we covered a little bit of this, but does there seem to be hotspots around the country, and do you have any idea why some are more active than others?
Well, I think I mentioned what I found here, and I believe it's probably a situation similar to what I've heard from others, that there's a definite connection between energy sources. So a lot of the areas where this phenomena seems to be more active, it's in areas where there's different types of energy, high tension power lines, radio towers, railroad tracks, reservoirs, different types of energy sources. I think are very, very common to many of these reports. And again, a lot of the places it's sporadic phenomena or it just happens, but a lot of places where it's more active, more consistent, I think there's something else going on there that people keep reporting.
Thanks for answering that. Stan, it's been amazing talking to you. There's just so much information to process. And I can't believe there's that many reports, but obviously there is. And more stuff out there that isn't being reported. And it's fascinating, and I can understand why you've spent so many years dedicated to the search for answers, maybe, or at least for being there for people to report these incidences and to show that someone actually cares and is looking into, as much as you can into these cases.
That's right. And we just barely touched on a few cases. I mean, there are thousands of reports. It's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable how many of these cases go on. And again, as I said, very commonly people contact me about cases that happened 10, 20, 30 years ago they never reported. And sometimes it's interesting because I have other cases from around the area from that time that confirms their reports. So that's something that some people found very interesting to them.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to encourage everyone to go over to your website, go and check out Stan Gordon. I've put the link in the description there, and I'll put some links up for your books as well. I'm certainly going to be looking a lot further into this because I've just found it fascinating tonight, and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all that with us, Stan.
Well, thanks for having me on. Maybe we'll do it again one day.
I'd definitely love to have you back one day, and I'm going to sort out the audio so Brent can join in because I know he would have some great questions for you. And actually was going to have Ron Moorhead coming on tonight with us as well because he wanted to ask a few questions because he's fascinated with all this, obviously. But he couldn't make it, unfortunately. So we'll do it again, definitely.
All right. Well, listen, take care, everybody over there. Stay safe, and thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you. You take care too. Good to speak to you. Good night.
You too. Good night.
Thank you. Well, there you go. Sorry, Brent. Maybe we should explain what happened.
Yeah, it has to do with the technologies. We just tried to.
Can you hear him?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Stan. I meant to let you go there.
Okay, well, go ahead. I'll get hang up. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Stan. Good night. Bye-bye.
So, ladies and gentlemen, what happened was Daniela was using the streaming software and Skype, and what happens is there's a problem with Skype in that it doesn't grab like all the audio from a computer. It just grabs a main line. So everything I was saying wasn't getting there. So we tried an experiment to use Skype, but then I had echoey hell here, so I couldn't hear a lot of what was going on for a long time.
And
So.
Stan couldn't hear you either.
Yeah,
so I've no idea what that is. Gary Johnson, let me just say that I don't want everything in caps because I'm trying to find the questions which I asked for in capital letters. And I know you've got a story to tell. I'd like you to just get in touch with me, Daniela@hiddenexistence.com, and talk to me about that. But I'm not going to delete anything. I just don't want capital letters all the time unless it's a question because it just makes it much easier for me to find them. So, well, thanks again, Brent.
It was great to be here. I loved the interview. I mean, Stan is absolutely fascinating, and his breadth of experience and knowledge and the amount of work he's done is just mind-numbing. So, I mean, I loved being here and listening to him, even if I wasn't really able to directly participate. It was really great. You did a great job, and it was a phenomenal show.
Yeah, thank you. He holds so much information, doesn't he? I mean, you can't imagine 51 years of logging all these reports. It's just
I'm just amazed because I can hardly remember what I had for dinner yesterday, and this guy's going back to the 60s. You know, it's like, whoa. I
have to say, just as the show started, my next door neighbor messaged me, and every other Saturday night they get a takeout, and they always get too much, and they usually ring me and say, "Do you want some leftovers?" And they sent me a message, and they've left a nice Turkish takeout. It's probably on my doorstep now, freezing cold. I'm going to go and get that. Thanks to everyone. Maybe we should do it over on the Paranormal Portal next time.
Yeah,
and get all the audio worked out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to co-interview with you as well. I mean, I've always had a great time, and you're a dear friend, and I've always enjoyed working with you. So whenever you want to, just let me know.
Brilliant. I think if people realize the struggles we got to get here tonight, and then for that happened, it's like, anyway, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining in, for the questions, for subbing, for liking, for sharing, for being great, being who you are, being here. Back on the Researchers Report on Wednesday night with Randy Harrington. I'll see you all then. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Oh, and go and check out the Paranormal Portal.
Yeah, please.
yeah. Go and check out Brent very, very soon. When is it, Brent? It's a few hours yet, isn't it?
Yeah, at 7 p.m. Pacific time tonight. We got Yowie researcher Dean Harrison joining us. He's a fantastic interview, a great guy, and just an amazing storyteller. So tune in, be a part of it.
Yeah. If I'm awake at that time, I'll try and call in without a harmonica. Good night, everyone.
Good night.